Welcome back to our bedtime story time. Tonight's story is called She Raised Them All, but Grew Old Alone. It is a touching story about an elderly woman who spends her days waiting for the love and care of her family. Through her journey, we will discover the importance of kindness, gratitude, and never forgetting the parents and elders who once cared for us. So, get comfortable, relax, and let this heartfelt story guide you into a peaceful night. Now, let's begin.
On a quiet road at the edge of a small village stood a little wooden house. The house was old, just like the woman who lived inside it. Her name was Margaret. Margaret was 78 years old. Her hair was white, her back was slightly bent, and her steps were slow. She lived alone in the little house because her husband had passed away many years earlier. She had no children. She did have 3 siblings, 2 brothers named Robert and Samuel, and a younger sister named Helen. However, although they were still alive, none of them looked after her. The years had carried them in different directions. Robert lived in a large city with his family. Samuel had moved to another town. Helen lived only an hour away, but she rarely visited. Margaret often sat by her window and watched the road. Every morning, she hoped that someone would come. Every evening, she closed the curtains and told herself not to expect too much. One cold autumn morning, Margaret slowly got out of bed. "Oh dear," she whispered, "my knees hurt again." She carefully walked to the kitchen and prepared a simple breakfast. She made a cup of tea and toasted 2 slices of bread. As she ate, she looked at an old photograph on the wall. The photograph showed 4 smiling children. Those children were Margaret, Robert, Samuel, and Helen. Back then, they had spent every day together. They had played in the fields. They had shared meals. They had promised to take care of one another forever. Margaret smiled sadly. "Life changes so much," she said softly. After breakfast, she needed groceries. Unfortunately, there was no nearby store within walking distance. She would have to take the bus. The bus stop was nearly 15 minutes away. For a young person, that walk was easy. For Margaret, it felt like climbing a mountain. She put on her coat and slowly walked outside. The wind was cold. Her hands trembled slightly. After several minutes, she finally reached the bus stop and sat on the bench. A young woman standing nearby noticed her. "Are you all right, ma'am?" she asked. "Yes, thank you," Margaret replied with a gentle smile. "I'm just moving a little slower these days." The young woman smiled and offered to help carry her shopping later. Margaret thanked her warmly. The kindness of strangers often brightened her day. The bus arrived, and they traveled into town. After buying groceries, Margaret found that her bags were heavier than she expected. The young woman remembered her promise. "Let me help you," she said. "Oh, that's very kind of you," Margaret answered. Together, they carried the bags to the bus. On the way home, the young woman asked, "Do you live alone?" "Yes," Margaret replied. The young woman looked surprised. "Don't your family visit you?" Margaret hesitated. Then she quietly said, "Not very often." The young woman felt sorry for her. Later, she told her friends that she had met an elderly woman who lived alone and had very little support. Instead of repeating Margaret's exact words, she explained what Margaret had said. When Margaret arrived home, she thanked the young woman once again. "May good things come your way," she said. The young woman smiled and waved goodbye. That evening, Margaret heated a bowl of soup for dinner. As she ate, the house felt very quiet. Sometimes the silence seemed heavier than the walls themselves. She wished she had someone to talk to. A few days later, Margaret decided to call her sister Helen. She picked up the phone and dialed the number. After several rings, Helen answered. "Hello?" Helen said. "Helen, it's Margaret." "Oh, hello," Helen replied. "How are you?" "I'm doing fine," Margaret said. "I was wondering if you might visit sometime." There was a short pause. Helen sounded uncomfortable. "I'm very busy these days," she said. "Maybe next month." Margaret nodded, even though Helen could not see her. "I understand," she replied. After the call ended, Margaret sat quietly. She told herself not to feel disappointed. Still, her heart felt heavy. Helen later told her husband that Margaret had asked her to visit. Days turned into weeks. The weather became colder. One evening, a storm arrived. Heavy rain hit the roof. Strong winds shook the trees. Suddenly, the electricity went out. The house became dark. Margaret searched for a flashlight. Unfortunately, she slipped on a small rug and fell to the floor. "Oh!" she cried. Pain shot through her leg. For several minutes, she could not stand. Fear filled her heart. The house was silent except for the sound of rain. Eventually, she managed to reach a chair and pull herself up. After resting for a long time, she finally sat down. Tears filled her eyes. At that moment, she felt the loneliness more deeply than ever. "If only someone were here," she whispered. The next morning, she was still in pain. Walking was difficult. She called her brother, Robert. When he answered, she explained what had happened. "I fell last night," she said. "Are you badly hurt?" Robert asked. "I don't think so, but my leg hurts." Robert sounded concerned. "You should see a doctor." "Yes," Margaret replied, "I will." There was another pause. Then Robert said, "I'm sorry, Margaret. Work is very busy right now." Margaret knew what he meant. He was not coming. "I understand," she said quietly. After the call ended, Robert felt guilty. He told his wife that Margaret had fallen and was struggling alone. His wife looked at him seriously. "Then why aren't you helping her?" she asked. Robert had no answer. Meanwhile, Margaret visited a doctor. The injury was not serious, but she needed rest. The doctor advised her to avoid carrying heavy things. Margaret thanked him. As she slowly walked home, she wondered how she would manage. Who would carry groceries? Who would help clean the house? Who would drive her to appointments? She had no answers. A few days later, a boy named Daniel knocked on her door. Daniel lived nearby. He was 16 years old. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Margaret," he said. "Good afternoon, Daniel. My mother heard about your fall. She asked me to see if you need help." Margaret smiled warmly. "That is very thoughtful." Daniel carried firewood into the house. He fixed a loose gate in the yard. He even helped clean some fallen branches. Before leaving, he said, "If you need anything, Please tell me. Margaret's eyes became moist. Thank you, Daniel. That evening, she felt less alone. Over the next few weeks, Daniel visited regularly. Sometimes he brought groceries. Sometimes he simply sat and talked. Margaret enjoyed his company. One afternoon, Daniel asked, "Were you always alone?" Margaret shook her head. No, years ago, this house was full of life. She showed him old photographs. She told him stories about her childhood. She explained how her siblings and she used to laugh together. Daniel listened carefully. "What happened?" he finally asked. Margaret sighed. Life became busy. People moved away. They had jobs, families, and responsibilities. She paused. At first, everyone promised to stay close. Then, visits became less frequent. Calls became shorter. Eventually, months passed without hearing from anyone. Daniel looked sad. That must hurt. It does, Margaret admitted. Then she added, "But I try not to be angry." Daniel thought about her words for a long time. When he returned home, he told his parents about the conversation. He said that Margaret missed her family very much. His parents listened quietly. Daniel's mother said, "We should never forget the people who cared for us when we were young." Daniel nodded. Several weeks later, winter arrived. Snow covered the village. The roads became icy. Margaret rarely left the house. One morning, she woke up with a fever. She felt weak and tired. Getting out of bed seemed difficult. She tried calling Helen, but there was no answer. She called Robert. Again, there was no answer. She called Samuel. The phone rang many times. Finally, he answered. "Hello?" "Samuel," Margaret said weakly. "I don't feel well." Samuel sounded worried. "What happened?" "I have a fever." "I see." For a moment, Margaret hoped he would come. Instead, he said, "Maybe you should call a doctor." Then he quickly ended the conversation because he was busy. Margaret stared at the phone. A feeling of sadness washed over her. Years earlier, she had helped all of her siblings. She had babysat their children. She had cared for their parents. She had offered money when times were difficult. Now she needed help. Yet nobody came. That afternoon, Daniel knocked on her door. When she did not answer, he became worried. He looked through the window and saw her resting in a chair. Immediately, he called his parents. Together, they took Margaret to a clinic. The doctor examined her and prescribed medicine. Thankfully, she recovered after several days. Daniel's family checked on her every day. Margaret was deeply grateful. One evening, after she felt better, she said to Daniel's parents, "You have done more for me in a few weeks than some relatives have done in years." Daniel's mother gently replied, "No one should face old age alone." Those words stayed in Margaret's heart. Months passed. Spring arrived. Flowers bloomed across the village. One sunny afternoon, Robert unexpectedly visited. Margaret was surprised to see him. "Robert!" she exclaimed. He looked nervous. "May I come in?" "Of course." They sat together at the kitchen table. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Robert said, "I owe you an apology." Margaret listened quietly. "I have been thinking about you a lot," he continued. "I realized that I have neglected you." Margaret looked down at her hands. Robert's voice trembled. "You were always there for me when we were young. You helped me many times. Yet when you needed me, I was absent." Tears filled his eyes. "I am sorry." Margaret remained silent for a moment. Then she gently said, "Thank you for saying that." Robert explained that his wife had encouraged him to think about his responsibilities. He admitted that he had become too focused on work. He had convinced himself that he would visit someday. Unfortunately, someday kept moving further away. Margaret nodded. Many people make the same mistake. They believe there will always be more time. But life moves quickly. A few weeks later, Helen also visited. She confessed that she had often ignored Margaret's invitations. "I kept saying I was busy," Helen admitted. "The truth is that I never made time." Margaret appreciated her honesty. Soon after, Samuel came as well. For the first time in years, all 4 siblings sat together. The gathering felt strange at first. Then old memories began to return. They laughed about childhood adventures. They shared stories from the past. For a few hours, the years seemed to disappear. Later that evening, Margaret said something important. "I do not need expensive gifts." Her siblings listened carefully. "I do not need people to solve all my problems." She paused. "What I need is your presence, a phone call, a visit, a reminder that I am not forgotten." Nobody spoke. The truth of her words touched them deeply. Helen quietly wiped away a tear. Robert looked at the floor. Samuel nodded slowly. All of them understood. From that day forward, things began to change. The siblings created a schedule. Each week, one of them would call Margaret. Each month, one of them would visit. They also helped with groceries, appointments, and repairs around the house. The changes were not perfect. Life was still busy. However, they made a sincere effort, and that effort made a tremendous difference. Margaret's smile returned. The little house no longer felt quite so lonely. One summer evening, Margaret sat on her porch watching the sunset. Daniel joined her. The sky glowed orange and gold. Birds sang softly in the distance. Daniel smiled. "You seem happier these days." "I am," Margaret replied. Daniel asked, "What do you think young people should learn from your story?" Margaret thought for a moment. Then she answered slowly. "When we are young, our parents and grandparents often sacrifice everything for us." She continued, "They stay awake when we are sick. They work hard to provide food and shelter. They guide us when we make mistakes." Daniel nodded. Margaret looked toward the sunset. One day, they grow old. Their steps become slower. Their strength becomes weaker. She paused. "That is when they need us." Daniel listened carefully. "Many elderly people do not ask for much," Margaret continued. "They simply want love, respect, and companionship." The evening breeze gently moved through the trees. Margaret smiled. If we forget the people who cared for us, we lose an important part of our humanity. Daniel never forgot those words. Years later, he would share them with his own children. And whenever he spoke about Margaret, he would tell them how kindness can change a person's life. He would also tell them that neglect can cause deep pain, even when no harsh words are spoken. As darkness settled over the village, Margaret felt peaceful. She knew that life would never be perfect. She knew that aging would still bring challenges, but she also knew something else. She was no longer forgotten. And sometimes that makes all the difference in the world. Moral of the story: parents and elderly family members spend many years caring for us, guiding us, and supporting us. As they grow older, they need our love, time, and attention. Being busy is not an excuse to neglect them. A simple phone call, a visit, or a helping hand can mean more than we imagine. We should respect, appreciate, and care for our parents and elders while we still have the opportunity, because one day we may wish for more time that can never be returned.
Thank you for your time. If you like the story, please subscribe our channel for more. Good night. Have a sound sleep.